Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you, Pete, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. My title this evening is Are Libertarians Liberals, Conservatives, or Something Else? And so if you're exploring liberty, and that's what you're supposed to be doing here, if you're at a weekend exploring liberty, this is probably a question that in some form or another has occurred to you at one time or another. You might look at that question. You say, well, of course libertarians are liberals. I mean, it's right there in the name, liber, right? But you say, then again, every time I hear libertarians talked about in American political discussion or American political discourse, they're lumped in with or they're associated with conservatives. And then you might say, well, wait a minute, from what I know about libertarians, what I know about liberals, and what I know about conservatives, libertarians are nothing like those liberals and nothing like those conservatives. And so it's an important question. Are libertarians liberals, conservatives, or something else? Now, of course, there are two ways I could have done this. One way I could have done this is kind of as a page-turning mystery novel. That is, you don't find out until the 40th slide of 40 whether libertarians are liberals, conservatives, or something else. But I decided that we live in a low attention span culture. I decided also that there are some people who just can't stand the suspense. So instead, I'm going to begin with the answer. I'm going to begin with the answer on slide number 2, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time explaining why the answer is the answer. So, without further ado, are libertarians liberals, conservatives, or something else? The answer is yes. Yes, libertarians are liberals. Yes, libertarians are conservatives. Yes, libertarians are something else. You say, wow, that was a real letdown, Professor Marcoux. I thought you were going to give us the definitive answer, and instead you've left me with the same question I had at the beginning. And I want to say I'm doing that for a reason, and the reason is because I actually do believe that's the correct answer. Let me explain why. We use the words liberal and conservative in a dichotomous way in at least two different ways. In other words, we think that liberals are different from conservatives, but we think that liberals are different from conservatives in two different domains, or if I may sound quasi-mathematical for a moment, along two different vectors, right? So the first one is the politico-philosophical vector. Now look at what I just did there. I just engaged in a bunch of disciplinary chest thumping without anyone noticing it. That's Rodin's thinker, right? And I'm associating Rodin's thinker with my field, political philosophy. I'm trying to imagine that when Rodin's thinker was thinking those deep thoughts, he was thinking philosophical thoughts. So I'm twitting the economists in the room, right? Imagining that when it comes to deep thought, that's philosophy, baby, not economics, right? So one, we use liberal and conservative to denote two politico-philosophical positions, right? But we also use liberal and conservative in a journalistic sense. This journalistic sense has something to do with American political discourse. It has to do with practical politics, but it doesn't necessarily map on to the politico-philosophical senses of liberal and of conservative. So let me start with the politico-philosophical senses of liberal and of conservative so that I can start to explain my answer to the question I began with, which is, of course, yes. So politico-philosophically, liberals, politico-philosophically, are people who believe that liberty is the paramount political value. Now, they don't necessarily believe that liberty is the only political value, but they believe that among the political values that we have, liberty is the highest political value. And if you're a liberal, you probably believe that you shouldn't be pursuing other political values in a way that diminish liberty, unless you have the mother of all good reasons for doing it, right? But you're a liberal if you believe, among the array of political values that we have in the world, right, that liberty is the highest political value. So no sooner do we observe that liberals are people who believe that liberty is the highest political value, is the paramount political value, then do we recognize that as liberalism has become the regnant political view, at least in places like Western Europe and like North America, that there are two senses of liberty and that there exists an intramural dispute or an intramural disagreement among liberals about how we should characterize and about how we should understand liberty. And so one way, represented by the little sign on the left, one way that we can understand liberty is negatively, right? And so negative liberty is the idea that liberty consists in the absence of external restraint. So in other words, you are at liberty. You are free to do whatever if no one or nothing is restraining you from doing that thing, right? And so this idea of liberty as the absence of external restraint is the one that we associate with classical liberalism, right? Classical liberalism is usually understood to be the view that liberty consists of the absence of external restraint. And this was, at least for the early period of liberalism's rise, this was the regnant view of what liberty is, right? But as liberalism started to sweep the field, as it went from a really radical view, a radical minority view among political philosophies, to being the paramount or the primary or the central one, there began to be fissures, there began to be splinterings emerging in the liberal worldview. And so other liberals started to think and say, no, liberty does not consist or does not consist merely of the absence of external restraint. No, liberty is a matter of being able to make your choices effective. Right? You are not free. You are not at liberty with respect to doing something, says this view, unless you have the means, unless you have the wherewithal, unless you have the resources that you need in order to make your choices effective. So absence of external restraint is not enough. Absence of external restraint may be a necessary condition in order to exercise your liberty, but it is not a sufficient condition. And so this is called the positive liberty view. The positive liberty view says that you need the means or the wherewithal or the resources to make your choices effective, otherwise you are not free, otherwise you are not at liberty. And this is the view that we associate with modern or welfare or high liberalism. I'm not suggesting that all high liberals are high, but, well, some people, particularly people in the classical liberal camp, do tend to believe that. We can see this splintering, we can see this divergence of liberal views happening in one of the most important works of the liberal canon. This is John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. If you read On Liberty carefully, and I'm not saying that I have, but I have it on reliable authority, that if you read On Liberty carefully, John Stuart Mill begins the book a classical, a negative liberty liberal. But by the end of the book, he has become a positive liberty liberal. He's gone from being, in our parlance, a classical liberal to a modern or a welfare or a high liberal. And so this dispute, this intramural disagreement among liberals is the most important dynamic within liberalism. Right? So in the politico-philosophical sense, liberalism is the idea that liberty is the paramount political value, but there are intramural disagreements among liberals about how it is that we ought to understand liberty. Like liberalism, conservatism has a politico-philosophical sense. Now here, conservatism in the politico-philosophical sense is less a program or a position or a position about politics. I think the conservative idea in the politico-philosophical sense is probably best articulated by Michael Oakeshott in his essay on being conservative. Oakeshott says that to be conservative is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, and so forth. Right? So conservatism is less a program of politics than it is a disposition toward politics. It is a disposition to preserve or to conserve that which is good, and to be open to change only insofar as change is necessary to preserve the greater part of the social order. Right? So this is conservatism in the politico-philosophical sense, and conservatism is more historically than it is ideologically rooted. If any of you have been familiar with reading, for example, National Review magazine, right, when William F. Buckley Jr. was still alive, right, he often liked to say that conservatism was the negation of ideology. The idea being that conservatism in its politico-philosophical sense is about trying to preserve or conserve an existing order rather than trying to reach an imagined utopia. Right? So why do I mention this? Well, one thing that's interesting about this is that you can be conservative in this dispositional sense about anything. You can be conservative even about liberalism, and that's pretty much where Michael Oakeshott was. Michael Oakeshott lived during most of the 20th century. He grew up and lived in a nation that was, for much of history, the principal exemplar of the liberal worldview, that being the United Kingdom. So Oakeshott has this conservative disposition, but he has it about liberal institutions and liberal practices. Right? So why am I telling you all of this? Libertarians are politico-philosophical liberals. That liber is a Q, right? They are. Some libertarians arrive at their liberalism by way of the conservative disposition, but libertarianism is, in the politico-philosophical sense, a liberal political view. So that's why the first part of the answer, yes. Yes, libertarians are liberals. Why? Because they have a basically liberal politico-philosophical worldview. And so that's what I wanted to say about the politico-philosophical sense of liberal and of conservative. Now, what of the journalistic sense? What of the journalistic sense of liberal and of conservative? Right? Well, here what we want to know is, how did libertarians come to be identified? How did libertarians come to be identified as conservatives in American political discourse? Why is it that whenever you open a newspaper and libertarians are being talked about, they're often not talked about as libertarians, or even if they are, at some point it's mentioned that they are conservatives or that they fall in with conservatives? I recall a Facebook post by Trevor Burrus of the Cato Institute a few months ago. There had been a New York Times story that had made reference to the ultra-conservative Cato Institute. And Trevor said, yep, that's us. He said, that's us. We're those gay marriage-loving, drug-legalizing ultra-conservatives you're always hearing about. Right? So it's kind of a weird thing. Why is it that libertarian political figures and libertarian public policy think tanks get lumped in with conservatives when, as we've just been through, politico-philosophically, they're liberals, right? Well, there's an answer to this. And it's that we're using the terms liberal and conservative to denote something very different. From the politico-philosophical sense of liberal and of conservative. We're using these things extensionally. That is, liberal and conservative don't so much define an idea in the journalistic sense of liberal and of conservative than it does identify certain people and how they cluster. So what am I talking about? Well, let's talk about liberalism in the journalistic sense. When a journalist talking about American politics uses the word liberal, here's what the journalist means. The journalist means basically these people, That's what a journalist means when a journalist says liberal. Who are those people? Well, let's see. Up to the left, we have pro-choice activists. Bottom left, we have labor union activists. Bottom right, well, I was about to say that we have a tree hugger, an environmentalist, but clearly she's going past second base and trying to slide into third. But you get the idea. Environmentalists, right? And up in the upper right, let's see. Corporations are not people. Liar with the Romney-Ryan logo on it. Democracy versus plutocracy, right? These are Occupy Wall Street type people. What do all of these people have in common such that they would be identified by journalists as liberal? What do they have in common? Any ideas? Do they have anything in common at all? What do they have in common? I'm sorry? They're promoting change. Okay, now certainly that would be a way that they would self-identify, right? Say, we're in favor of change. Now, of course, I imagine that people who oppose them politically also understand themselves to be in favor of change. So change, while it may have great rhetorical resonance, doesn't actually explain what's going on. What might they have in common in terms of practical American politics? Okay, so government regulation, although at least some of them, right, the pro-choice folk would understand themselves to be, no, we're getting government regulation off of women. What do they have in common in terms of the major political parties?
They're more democratic left-leaning.
Right, that basically what liberal means in the journalistic sense, at least in American political discourse, is client group of the Democratic Party. Right? That's all that it means. And I mean, what's interesting is that I think that there are relatively few within the Democratic Party, there are relatively few people who are any more liberal, either in the negative liberty or in the positive liberty sense. Perhaps the last major political figure in the Democratic Party who was politico-philosophically liberal as well as being journalistically liberal was someone like Ted Kennedy. I mean, remember, Ted Kennedy was a passionate advocate of airline deregulation. He was a passionate advocate of airline deregulation because he said, this is something that will give people the wherewithal, that will give them the wherewithal to make their choices effective. If consumers face lower airline prices through competition, this will make them better able to exercise autonomy over their lives and to make their choices effective, right? So the interesting thing is here is that in the journalistic sense, liberal just means clients of the Democratic Party. So what does conservative mean? What does conservative mean? Well, it basically just means these people, the anti-abortionists, the Tea Partiers who are upset about the Internal Revenue scoundrels, right? People who stand up for religious freedom and the National Association of Manufacturers. What do these groups have in common? They are client constituencies of the Republican Party. That's what liberal and conservative mean in the journalistic sense. So you say, well, all right, fine, that's great, I guess, as a definitional or a quasi-definitional way of understanding what liberal and conservative mean in the journalistic sense. But what does any of this have to do with why libertarians might be conservative, right? Well, it has two things to do with it. Actually, one of them harkens back to the politico-philosophical sense of liberal, and the other one leans heavily on the journalistic one. So two ways in which libertarians are conservative in the appropriate journalistic sense. One has to do with the splintering of liberalism. When liberalism becomes the regnant view in the West, liberals start looking at each other and they say, well, wait a minute, when we were in the minority among political views, right, we understood ourselves to be very close, right? But now that we have the regnant political view, I look at what you're talking about when you're talking about liberalism, and I look at what I'm talking about when I'm talking about liberalism, and I see some distance. I see some disagreement. I see some tension. And so as the positive liberty idea started to gain ground within the liberal political worldview, some people adopted it and others resisted. The ones who resisted then came to be known as classical liberals, and they were understood within the liberal sphere. They were understood to be conservative. Why? Because they were trying to preserve and hold on to the older, the negative liberty understanding of liberty. Right? And those who were abandoning the negative liberty understanding of liberty for the positive liberty understanding looked at the others and said, wow, you're so conservative. Right? You're not down with the change. You're not down with the change, right? So one reason why libertarians are conservative in an appropriate sense is because for the most part they identify with the negative liberty rather than the positive liberty sense of liberty or freedom. The second reason why libertarians are conservative in the journalistic sense is because they have a long-standing historical association with conservatives by way of a peculiar political history. This man is Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer was one of the early editors and writers for National Review magazine. He was a man who, at least in terms of today's understandings, would have been understood as a rompin'-stompin' libertarian. Right? But National Review magazine, in addition to attracting some rompin'-stompin' libertarians like Frank Meyer, also attracted traditionalist and religious conservatives. And so what was funny is that people with a lot of different or seemingly different political views were gathered under this one tent at National Review. Well, Meyer said there has to be something more to all of us being together here under this tent than the fact that we have a common enemy, modern liberalism. And he said, I believe that despite our passionate disagreements between libertarians and between social or religious or traditionalist conservatives, that somewhere at a much deeper level, there is an agreement. There is a common understanding about the way the world works. We have more than a common enemy, but at an appropriate level of abstraction, we have a common worldview. And he branded this worldview fusionist. He said fusionism is the right view. Conservatism and libertarianism, rightly construed, have a common philosophical heritage. So two things are interesting about this. One, Meyer believed this passionately and wrote about it a lot. Two, just about everyone who read Meyer's thesis said, you're wrong, Frank, you're completely wrong. They pointed at the other people in this coalition and said, no, we're not like them. But as Meyer reports and as William F. Buckley Jr. reports, eventually everyone just kind of acquiesced to it. They didn't say, I'm convinced, but they said they got tired of fighting and said, yeah, whatever my differences with you, Mr. Libertarian, or whatever my differences with you, Mr. Conservative, they pale in comparison to my differences with the regnant modern liberalism in the United States today. Right? And so National Review, under the editorship of William F. Buckley Jr., was the official organ of fusionism. And you can see that, actually, you can see it in William F. Buckley Jr.'s mission statement for National Review in the very first issue in 1955. He says, with respect to the growth of government, without reservations, we are on the libertarian side. Says it right there, 1955, in so many words. He says, with respect to our conflict between the social engineers seeking utopias and the disciples of truth who defend the organic moral order, we are without reservations on the conservative side. So National Review was committed to this basically fusionist idea that beneath surface disagreements between conservatives and libertarians, there lay a more basic agreement about philosophical principles. Now, of course, probably the most important thing holding this fusionist coalition, if you will, together was an even more important common enemy than modern liberalism, right? And that was communism, right? Anti-communism probably did more to hold together libertarians and conservatives than anything else. Libertarians, because communism was anti-liberty, right? Conservatives, because communism was anti-family, was anti-God, was anti-institutions intermediate between the individual and the state, right? And so this fusionist coalition, whether we understood it merely as an alliance of political convenience or as Meyer wanted to understand it, as an expression of a deeper philosophical agreement, right? This was the big idea in terms of which libertarians are understood or are spoken about in American political discourse even today as conservatives. You can see this fusionist idea alive today in practical politics in the presidential campaign of Rand Paul. Now, in talking about this, I am not commending Rand Paul's candidacy. And in saying that, I am not denigrating Rand Paul's candidacy. I just point out Rand Paul's candidacy because the way he has gone about running his campaign is demonstrative of the idea that he is trying to build a Meyer-like fusionist coalition. And so he says things like the following: I'm a libertarian Republican. Libertarian, speaking in the politico-philosophical sense, right? He says, and I'm a constitutional conservative, saying conservative in the journalistic sense, right? Similarly, I find his campaign fascinating because on a policy level, he's usually on the libertarian position, or at the very least with respect to what's politically possible in the Overton window, he's at the libertarian end of the Overton window. But whenever he expresses the policy position, he expresses his personal sympathy with conservative views. So talking, for example, about the Supreme Court's gay marriage decision, right? He says, I believe we need to get the government out of marriage. That's the libertarian position. And then he goes on to say, but I am personally offended by same-sex marriage, expressing the sympathy with the social conservatives, right? He's trying to sew together a conservative libertarian coalition to get elected. Now, you may think that's pandering, you may think that's brilliant politics, I don't know. But it's an interesting thing. In an interesting way, it's almost the inverse of what Ronald Reagan did when he ran for office, which was often pursue conservative policies, but speak the language of liberty to attract the libertarians, right? So why am I telling you this, right? Libertarians are journalistic conservatives two ways. One, by way of their conservatively inflected rejection of modern liberalism, and two, by way of their historical association with conservatives by way of the fusionist movement. So that leaves the last question. Why are libertarians something else? Right? Why are libertarians something else? Well, I think libertarians are interestingly something else besides liberals and something else besides conservatives by way of their fervor in pursuit of the idea that liberty is the paramount political value. Because although lots of people believe that liberty is the paramount political value, libertarians are the most stringent about not trading liberty against other values. You know, classical liberals broadly construed may believe that liberty is the paramount political value, yet they may believe, consistent with their classical liberalism, that there are margins along which maybe a diminution in liberty is okay if we get some other political value, like social stability or security or what have you. But libertarians tend to be deontic. They tend to be deontic about the idea that liberty is the paramount political value. And whether that's by way of something like the so-called non-aggression principle, or whether that's by way of something like having a really robust view about human autonomy flourishing most most readily in a negative liberty perspective. The idea is that libertarians are less likely to admit other political values to the discussion if admitting those other political values to the discussion runs the risk of diminishing liberty. So that, in an important sense, separates them from other liberals, whether those liberals be negative liberty liberals or positive liberty liberals. It certainly separates them from conservatives who tend to have a more, in the politico-philosophical sense, non-ideologically driven and more historical and preservationist-driven approach to politics. So, libertarians are liberals in the politico-philosophical sense. Libertarians are conservatives in the journalistic sense. Libertarians are something else entirely, because their approach to politics is in an important way meaningfully different from both. With that, I am done. Thank you.
Yes, can you talk a little bit about, I've seen a phrase periodically, usually associated with certain economists, anarcho-libertarian.
Okay.
Can you talk about what exactly that is?
Okay, so there is an intramural dispute amongst classical liberals and amongst classical liberals who self-identify as libertarians about what the position actually entails, right? And so some would say, and I think I would be warm to them, right, that the heart of liberalism is anarchism. Is the idea that government authority is in some important way, right, antithetical to the exercise of human autonomy. So the question is, if anarchism is the heart of liberalism, is it also the policy of liberalism? Anarcho-capitalists are people who say, hell yes. Right? They say, if we are true and consistent and down to the tips of our toes liberals, right, and we have particularly this negative liberty conception of what liberty is, then the logical fallout of that is that we must be anarchists. We are anarchists, but we are pro-private property, ergo, we are anarcho-capitalists. Other classical liberals who self-identify as libertarians believe, like the anarcho-capitalists, that the heart of liberalism is, in effect, anarchism, but that cannot be the policy. That cannot be the policy of liberalism. It can't be the policy of liberalism because an anarcho-political order is inherently unstable, right? It's not a stable equilibrium. And so if you read Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, this is pretty much his argument, right? He says, imagine the anarcho-state. Pretty good, I like it. However, whether we want it to happen or not, we are going to, and what one of the subsections of one chapter of the book is actually titled this, we're going to back into a state without really trying, right? So he believes that the stable equilibrium is to have the ultra-minimal or night watchman state, cops, courts, and a military, right? Now, of course, the anarcho-capitalists don't take this lying down. They say, Robert, what makes you think that government, once established, can limit itself to cops, courts, and a military? So I think this is actually an interesting intramural dispute amongst libertarians. It's not a dispute, as it's often portrayed, as being over our values. So some libertarians seem to talk like the others don't really adopt the values. Say, you aren't a real libertarian if you aren't an anarcho-capitalist. But I think what the debate is really about is not values, but about your background social theory and what you understand to be within the realm of possibility. So each seems to suggest that the other's preferred institutional framework is inherently unstable, and that the one that they prefer is the most plausible and most libertarian one. Does that help some with anarcho-capitalism? Okay, good. Thomas, hoots of derision, yes?
Are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt's philosophy and writings?
I'm familiar with Jonathan Haidt. Yes, as a matter of fact, he is speaking at my university, Creighton, next week. Yes. So, what about Jonathan Haidt?
No. I'm not going to do that. Yeah, if you're familiar with him, do you have anything to say about how he fits with this presentation?
Well, this is, of course, a very interesting thing because, you know, he's a psychologist by training, and one of the things that he's very interested in is cross-referencing political views with social attitudes, right? And so he says, one of the things that he says that is very interesting is that in terms of the social attitudes around which liberals and around which conservatives cluster, and he says one of the most interesting axes along which to place liberals and conservatives is what he calls capacity for disgust. And he says basically conservatives have a high disgust reflex or instinct or disposition, and liberals have a relatively low, right, disgust reflex or disposition. He said when you view it that way, he says libertarians actually out-liberal the liberals. They have even less of a disgust reflex or instinct or disposition than liberals do. So in terms of the question that I asked at the beginning, Haidt applying his paradigm would say, oh, the answer's easy. Libertarians are liberals. They're uber liberals, right? Is that what you were thinking in terms of? Yeah, no, he's a fascinating character and really does interesting work. I look forward to his talk. Yes?
One of the criticisms you often hear about libertarianism in general is that it doesn't say much about normative questions. So you hear like, people say things like, the non-aggression principle applies, so it doesn't matter. A libertarian can be a racist, can be a sexist. The ultimate outcome doesn't matter. You could be a techno-futurist libertarian, or you could be a survivalist libertarian living in a bunker. Do you think that is a fair way to view libertarianism? Do you think it says anything, or do you think just a general preference for the market is the only important normative question?
Well, there's a whole lot of terminology around this, right? So one intramural dispute amongst libertarians is called thin versus thick, right? That is, so do you understand libertarianism to be a view only about the extent of justified political authority? Or do you understand libertarianism to be a comprehensive social theory, right? It seems to me the problematic part are libertarians, particularly libertarians who are attracted to the non-aggression principle as the ground for everything, believing that it is a comprehensive social theory, right? That as long as you adhere to the non-aggression principle, you know, you are a moral superhero. Right? And now, my own view is that that's absurd. Right? My view is that libertarianism is a political philosophy. It is not a comprehensive social ethics. We have perfectly legitimate moral grounds for condemning somebody who respects and recognizes your libertarian political rights, but who fails to act virtuously, who fails to act generously, who fails to recognize the importance of tolerance in maintaining a social order, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is it is a fair criticism of some who self-identify as libertarians, but I think that's hardly the most well-defended and well-thought-out of libertarian views. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that for those whom the criticism hits, I think it's good that they get hit with it because they've not thought out just what libertarianism is. I self-identify as a very thin libertarian. I say this is just about what Mill called it political morality. What is it legitimate to do through political authority? That's what libertarianism tells you. Does it tell you how to live the good life? Does it tell you how to maintain a social order? Does it tell you how you ought best to conduct yourself with your fellows? No, not at all. And so yes, if you do think as long as I'm in compliance with the non-aggression principle, I'm A-okay, you have a politics but no ethics. Okay. Yes?
It seems to me that libertarianism is really an expression of fighting rules and regulations and big government versus small government and freedom. So one of the proponents of that is Charles Murray, and I'd like to know what you think about Charles Murray.
What do I think about Charles Murray? Boy, that's hard. I admire Charles Murray. I have since I was an undergraduate and read Losing Ground. I don't know what to say about Charles Murray qua libertarianism. I mean, yeah, my sense is that his is a basically libertarian worldview, right? You know, I mean, but I'm probably not deep enough in his writings to say anything more than that. So I guess what that means is that I should hang my head in shame and leave. No, okay.
He's got some really good ideas about what would work in his mind
Sure.
in a smaller form of government
Yeah.
than what most liberals want, which is being ruled by government and being actually owned by government
Yeah.
versus being owned by yourself.
Yes. Yeah, I have to say, Charles Murray actually scared me recently. He had a questionnaire online called "How Thick Is Your Bubble?" And it was about how insulated you were from, shall we say, median America, right? And I tend to regard myself as being an opponent of urban elites and more a man of the people. But boy, his questionnaire showed me that I was wrong about that. That my bubble is actually very thick, and so I'm trying to get out more, eat at Applebee's, you know, wear a polo shirt with, you know, my employer's name on it, just so I can be a little bit more like the rest of America at large. Let's see, other questions, concerns? Yes.
Well, I'd like to back the conversation up just a little bit, because it's really obvious that you've thought about this a lot more than me, and I feel like I've thought about it a long time.
Oh, well,
So
thank you, I think.
I want to go back to the journalist at the New York Times.
Okay.
Who put the Cato Institute over there
Mhm.
with the conservatives.
Yes.
And you have this long track of how they would come to this idea, but I've always just thought that they hadn't thought about it very much. This is a journalism major who probably never took a philosophy class or an econ class. Couldn't it just be that they just write this because they're lazy and they haven't thought of it?
Well, yes, but what that tells you, right, is that these are the ideas that are in the air and that are easy for them to grab without thinking, right? So the journalistic conception, basically no one's thinking, what does liberal and conservative mean? They're just saying, how do people cluster, right? And so liberal has come to mean, in journalistic parlance, these people who are clients of the Democratic Party, and conservative has come to mean the other. And if you understand it that way, and you recognize that the Cato Institute gets some money from the Koch Foundation, although not nearly as much as people seem to think, and you say, gee, Charles Koch tries to make sure that Republicans get elected, you see where they're coming from. I agree it's intellectually lazy.
So that argument works great for the junior journalist that's out there that's only
Sure.
been on the beat for a few years, but
Right.
somebody that's been out there a long time can see that that's inconsistent. So somebody who's, well, 50 or 60 years old, who
Sure.
can see how people have changed their mind about issues. A
Yes.
conservative issue in the 50s was all about let's go in there and agree and let's fix this, and the liberal issue was no, man, let's stay out. And then as time goes by, so yeah, your idea is okay, but I don't know that it holds in the long run.
I'm not sure what doesn't hold in the long run.
Yeah, okay.
Well, no, I'm willing to take the criticism. I'm just, what is it that you're saying doesn't hold in the long
Maybe
run?
that stupid that long, is that what you're asking?
I think they're probably just lazy and they're really young and they're just trying to get their articles out.
Right. And the older and perhaps more thoughtful journalists
wouldn't
have a
think
vested
like that.
interest in the narrative.
Maybe.
Yeah, yeah. They are ideologues, and they recognize how the narrative allows them to push their worldview.
So could you elucidate a bit more also about the corruption, if you would like to use that word, maybe it's
Okay.
it's unfair to say corruption. The corruption of language in the last 30, 40, 50 years. In
Yeah.
Europe, a liberal is not what a liberal is in the United States.
Sure.
And the origin of liberalism comes from the Anglo-French sphere of the 18th and 19th century.
Sure.
So there's been a corruption. Could you help sort of elucidate that?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm a little bit more sympathetic to it, such that I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a corruption. I think part of the reason why liberal means something different in Europe than it does in the United States is because the United States, more so than Europe, fell hard for liberalism, right? The United States became a liberal republic. And so what it means to be conservative within this liberal republic is to hold on to the older negative liberty conception rather than to the newer positive liberty conception of liberty. Right.
But would
So,
you
yeah.
say that so-called modern liberalism
Yes.
or social liberalism
Yes.
is really in some ways a variant, a diluted variant of Western European social democratic thought?
I think so. Yeah, it maps onto it most closely, and the most illiberal elements of the Democratic Party, right, adopt policies that, although they were justified initially in positive liberal terms, they now adopt them for reasons that have nothing to do with human autonomy or anything like that. Instead, they're concerned about equality. Right, they're egalitarian. So yes, I agree with that. That in the middle 80% of cases, what passes as liberal in American political discourse is social democratic if you were to try to map it onto Europe. Okay. Yes.
So you were talking about sort of like at one point you did say that nothing stands in the long run, but do you think that the fusionism between conservatives and libertarianism is so melded together that they could never be unassociated with each other, like going forward, at least journalistically? Or do you think there's a possibility for maybe one day libertarianism to kind of have its own sect, or even end up sort of fusing with liberals at a point?
Well, so let's take the last thing that you talked about first, which is the idea of libertarianism fusing with modern liberalism, right? And so this was actually a project of some people at the Cato Institute. In fact, they gave it a name. They called it Libertarianism, right? And the idea was that they said, kind of like the Jonathan Haidt thing, if you look at the basic American liberal worldview and you look at what American libertarians believe, there's actually a great deal of meshing going on there. And is there a way that we can perhaps spur a kind of rapprochement between modern liberals and libertarians? So that's one thing. Question is, you say, are libertarians inextricably fused with conservatives? Well, it seems to me there are three levels of fusionism, right? So one level, and the deepest level, is philosophical fusionism. That's what Meyer was shooting for. I think that's dead. I think no one believes that at a very deep level, right, traditionalist or social or religious conservatives and libertarians have the same philosophical worldview. No one believes that anymore. The second level at which there can be fusionism is a policy level, right? Which is, well, can we adopt policies that both permit libertarians to allow to flourish in the world the sorts of institutions and the sorts of norms that they want, and social or religious or traditionalist conservatives do it too? I think conservatives and libertarians are looking at each other and saying, no, that can't work. The shallowest level of fusionism, and this is the one that I think Rand Paul is really trying to grab onto, is what I call electoral fusionism. That is, can we create an electoral environment that makes it possible for people of a more libertarian worldview and people of a more conservative worldview to flourish, right? And then once they flourish, they can fight it out over who wins at the policy level. I think that is still alive. But I really think that what is going on between conservatives and libertarians is a long and drawn out divorce, right? That after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I always like to say that fusionism died, the Berlin Wall fell on it, right? That once you lost communism, as a world historical enemy to liberalism broadly construed, libertarians and conservatives started looking at each other and saying, wait, what did I see in you, right? Well, the thing is, the same thing happened among liberals, right, in an earlier era. Liberalism was such a radical idea that anyone who was in the same basic ballpark, right, was an ally, right? But then once liberalism sweeps the field and we are all liberals now, then we see the fissures. We say, well, wait, some of us talk about liberalism in a positive liberty way, and some of us talk about liberalism in a negative liberty way. And you can even look back at the founding, and you look at the way Jefferson talks about liberty, and you look at the way Madison talks about liberty, and you say, wait a minute, with the passage of time, right, and with liberalism having swept the field, we can see the distance between them. I think that the distance between them was not perceptible in a world in which most people were illiberal, and anybody who had a basically liberal worldview looked indistinguishable to you from yourself. So I don't know if that answers your question or just kicks the can down the road, but I really believe that what is happening is that the fusionism that Meyer was talking about is on its way out. I don't think conservatives and libertarians are moving closer together. And I mean, you can even see this in the demography of events like this one. There was a time when a gathering of college libertarians was a gathering of Reagan Republicans who wanted to smoke pot, who said, hey, I thought we were the small government party. What's going on? Right? Now the biographies of students, there are still students like that who come to libertarian things, but an awful lot of them are disappointed progressives. You know, they supported Obama. They thought Obama shared their worldview. Obama let them down, and they started looking around, and maybe they ran into Ron Paul, maybe they ran into someone else, and they said, wait, maybe this is closer to what I'm looking for. Right? I think this too is symptomatic. So maybe people like Brink Lindsay, who was behind the libertarian thing at Cato, is on to something. And maybe if there is any sort of fusion, that's the direction in which things are going to fuse. Yes?
Alexei, don't hold this against me. I'm slugging through After Virtue by McIntyre.
Yes.
So my question is, from 1955 till today, this book, a little I can understand of it,
Yes.
is about the evolution and deconstruction of what we consider moral, what we consider
Right.
just, what we consider virtuous. That's
Mhm.
as much as I got out of this so far.
Right.
So how does this kind of conversation with conservative, liberal, libertarian, with these moving targets, with the deconstruction and evolution of what just society, what virtue, what morality is, how does this conversation, how is it, if you were to give this talk in 1955, how would it be different than today?
That's a really good question. So if I were to give this talk in 1955, right, I would probably be emphasizing more the idea that conservatives and libertarians have a project that they're working on together. How deep the project is philosophically would be open to question. And I guess another thing is that there would probably, between conservatives and libertarians circa 1955, there would probably be greater moral agreement between them about matters surrounding government. So one of the ways in which libertarians and conservatives have moved apart in the intervening half century is in terms of, I hate this term, right, but here we go, social issues, right? So I guess, yeah, I imagine a half century ago, I would think that there would be greater prospects. And of course, what? And if I'd given that talk that way in 1955, I would be right. Why? Because you'd get the Goldwater rump in '64, and you get it coming to fruition in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan.
on that for just a second and see, and go back to this whole point you were talking about that that it's liberal, it's conservative, it is something else. And going back to the idea of conservative and
Sure.
You know, what it meant in that traditional sense of trying to conserve.
Yes.
And I guess what I would say is that one of the things I think is interesting to think about and to point out to people, right, is that you can be socially conservative in your own personal viewpoints, right? So
Yes.
it is this sort of Rand Paul idea, right?
Sure.
Without it being something that is illogical or inconsistent. In other words, I can have a viewpoint that this is my moral belief and this is the way I want to live my life, right?
Right.
I would never tell anybody, I would never do X. But I don't have the authority, right, to tell someone else that they shouldn't live that they cannot live their life this way, right? And
Yes.
restrict their freedoms and ability to do so, and their own autonomy to do so. And that, I think, is philosophically and perfectly consistent, right? But somewhere along the line, we went and moved away from saying, okay, these are my moral values, and this is how I want to live my life. Everyone can live their life the way that they see fit, to say, no, you must live your life this way in terms of the conservative, in the journalistic sense, I think, more so.
Yeah, so the way I've tried to say this is by advancing the idea that social conservatism is an eligible lifestyle but a lousy politics, right? That it's a politics that lacks the tolerance that lies at the heart of any basically liberal worldview, and that's necessary in a world in which people have divergent conceptions of the good to live together. Without tolerance, we cannot live together if we have divergent conceptions of the good, right? Some social conservatives, I think of someone like Rick Santorum, want to say, well, so what if your conception of the good diverges from mine? Once I've got my hands on the levers of political power, I'm going to beat you with a club, right? So I think you're right. Rand Paul is actually trying to remind us of the tolerant heart of liberalism, I think. Whether he'll succeed at it or not, I don't know. You know, never ask a philosopher an empirical question.
Being one of the older folks in the room, I'm really curious about, is there an accepted moral criteria today? In other words, when I was growing up, I had a sense, and most people around me had an understanding of the word virtue.
Sure.
Or I had an understanding of the word morality. Or I had an understanding of the word just society. And I'm wondering if this de-evolution, I don't use that in a negative sense, is it de-evolution or a evolution, whatever, or a change as it said, safer word.
Okay.
I'm wondering if this change leads to a confusion, because there is no, we can talk about conservative, liberal, libertarian. Is there a livable moral criteria in this society? Well, that's what but natural law is not accepted anymore.
You mean, is there a single?
Well, in other words, natural law, when we were talking about the beginning of classical liberalism, or when we were talking about 1955, there still was an acceptance of natural law. Once, as this book I'm trying to read talks about, once we start to deconstruct natural law, where is the compass?
Right. Well, see, this is where I actually think that earlier liberal thinkers and people like John Stuart Mill, for example, were onto something. I think they recognized that if you pressed very hard on these things, they would fall apart. So they said what we need, rather than trying to make sure that one conception of the good or one sense of morality carries the day, we need to adopt political institutions that are accommodative of many different conceptions of the good, but allow us to live together in relative peace. That's what liberalism is all about. I think if you don't believe that moral disagreement is inevitable, I think it's hard to maintain your liberalism all the way down.
Yeah.
And you worry about that in Mill, right? Because Mill says, oh yeah, On Liberty, he says liberty is great. It allows us to engage in experiments in living and to find out which ways of living work and which ways don't. You say, well, wait a minute. If that's the justification for liberty, what happens when we make the discovery? This way of living is better than that. Now it seems you no longer have a justification for liberty, right? So there we are. Yes.
been a libertarian most of my life. I've been both a liberal libertarian and a conservative libertarian.
Okay.
I find the difference between the two is that a conservative libertarian does believe in natural law. A liberal libertarian does not. At least that's what was true for me.
Okay.
And just to expand that a little bit, you didn't talk too much about libertarians as close seconds to anarchism. I see a very close connection with that. And in fact, with a lot of left-wing politics, there was a big connection with libertarianism. To give an example, Karl Hess,
Right.
chief speechwriter for Barry
Goldwater, yes.
I actually met with him in 71 or 2 when he was at the Institute for Policy Studies.
Right.
He was the head of it.
Mhm.
So I mean, there's someone that went complete from writing Barry Goldwater's best speeches to being very left. That was very left-wing at that time.
Right, exactly. And what's interesting is your use of the words "went from," right, makes a lot of sense in terms of the journalistic senses of liberal and conservative, but maybe in terms of the political philosophical sense, he didn't go anywhere. Right? He just traced out the implications of his views. And of course, Murray Rothbard was also moved by this idea that there was some deeper sympathy between the left, particularly in its anti-Vietnam War manifestation, and libertarianism, and did a lot to play up the connections between the two. Before later in life going the other way and trying to get paleo-conservatives together with libertarians. Right? So that's an itself an interesting dynamic. Let's see. So concerns, comments, hoots of derision.
You didn't even mention Edmund Burke.
I'm sorry?
You didn't even mention Edmund Burke.
It's true. I didn't mention Edmund Burke. I mean, I suppose you could have put Burke into the slide that I used Oakeshott for. I used Oakeshott mainly just because I liked the quote in terms of these comparisons, right? But Burke would also be a good example of this idea that conservatism is historically rooted and is dispositional rather than something that has a blueprint for an ideal society, and is in that sense, a sense which William F. Buckley Jr. played up a lot, is in that sense anti-ideological, or is the rejection of ideology.
Would Russell Kirk be important reading on this?
Oh, well, very much so, right? Russell Kirk was very much part of that National Review crowd. He was also one who was very resistant to Meyer's fusionism, right? He didn't have much use for libertarians. He said, beneath our disagreement, Frank Meyer, lies disagreement, right? There is no deeper philosophical rapprochement. So yeah, he would be very important. He would be the American Oakeshott.
Yes.
Yes, or the American Burke in that sense. Beth, are you looking at me meaningfully? Does it mean it's that time? It's that time. Thank you very much.